And so now to understand suffering is now part of our nature. And Genesis 4:7, as we begin to really look at this, there's a statement that came up, and I want to read Genesis 4:7 first before I make this statement. Here is Cain, and Cain has a brother named Abel. And Cain and Abel is at this place where they're going at it. You know, Abel is that brother who's got it all together. I mean, he's got the sheep. He's good. He makes a sacrifice. God accepts his sacrifice. And Cain comes along with his sacrifice. He says, well, look, I really don't have much, so I'm going to give you, God, what I think you should have, so let me give you this grain. So he gives God the grain and the offering, and God does not accept his offering. And so he's upset about it. And he said, well, you don't get it. Why are you not taking my blessing? And this is what God says to him. He says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, watch this, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Now that's a lot on it right there. He says, if you do not do well, sin is at your door, and its desire is for you. So when I turn my heart away from God, what ends up happening is sin comes into the heart of man, and its desire is for me. And when sin's desire is for me and I walk away from God, what ends up happening is this statement that I put. When hearts turn from God, sin is free to manifest itself through the heart of man. When I'm in a place where I'm not in relationship with God, sin is free to manifest itself in whatever form. See, people don't understand. They ask the question, can somebody be born gay? Well, biologically, the answer is no. However, sin can manifest itself in any person in any way. So I'm born into sin, and how that sin chooses to manifest itself out of what doors I open determines whether or not I'm dealing with lust, determines whether or not I'm a kleptomaniac, determines whether or not I'm lying. How that sin manifests itself is in a different way. And so now God is trying to get them to understand the concept is that you shifted your attention, but you must rule over it. And the question is how do I rule over it? Well, I'm glad you asked. In Matthew 22, we find that this young lawyer comes up to Jesus and he says to him, he says, teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Then he says, right after that, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hinge the law of the Lord. So watch this. Did you notice he asked him, what was the greatest commandment? What was the greatest commandment? And Jesus gives him two. He gives him the first one, that you should love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, with all your soul. And he says the second is just like it, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. You ask the question, well, how can a human being do this to this child? How can a human being come in there and do what happened last Sunday and have a massacre of over 50 people? How could that happen? It's real simple. The first law wasn't observed. Because the second and the first law come hand in hand. You can't have the second law without having the first law. So when we ask the question, how can a man do something that causes suffering to another person? It's simple. When you don't have God in your equation, you can't love the brother who's next to you. And if I can't love the brother I see, how can I love the God that I can't see? And so the first question of why is there suffering, or how can a man cause harm to another person, it's very simple. I'd like to put it in this term. There was a story of a little boy who was in school. And this little boy was sitting there, his teacher is writing on the board. And as he's writing on the board, he says, there is evil in this world. And because there's evil in this world, if God is real, then that either means that God is evil or there is no God. Because the God you're telling me about says that he loves everybody. So therefore, if there's evil, God is evil or there is no God. This little boy in the back of the classroom raises his hand. He says, excuse me, teacher. He says, can I ask you a question? He goes, yeah. He says, is there such thing as darkness? The teacher goes, absolutely. Everybody knows that. He goes, no, you're actually wrong. Darkness is simply the absence of light. So the teacher looks back and he's a little confused. He says, excuse me, I got another question. He goes, what do you want? He says, is there such thing as cold? And the teacher goes, duh, everybody knows that. He goes, you're wrong again. Cold is simply the absence of heat. He says, okay, so is there such thing as evil? He goes, yeah. He goes, no, evil is simply the absence of God in the hearts of man. See, it was the little boy who raised his hand was Albert Einstein. See, if you really want the real questions to life, and you really want the answer to tonight, the objective tonight is not to ask the question that you're openly saying with your mouth. It's to ask the questions that you're asking in your heart. And so tonight I'd like to take you on that journey with me, if you will. It's in this next season, in this next topic, that I want to bring to you the point number 2. And this is the question that we're really asking that nobody really wants to ask. Because I love the idea of how thinking leads to questions. And questions lead to answers, and answers lead to results. Thinking leads to questions. Questions lead to answers. Answers lead to the results that you need in your life. So could it be that you're not getting the results you want because you're not asking the right questions? The second place, and the question that we should truly be asking ourselves, is why does God allow suffering? Or to put it in a better term, God, if you love me so much, why am I going through the pain that I'm going through? God, if you love me so much, and if you're such a loving God, and if you're with me to the end, then why am I going through the suffering that I'm experiencing right now? And what we find is oftentimes the person asking the question is either in the question, or it's about somebody who they become intimate with and they want the answers for them. So if we're going to be real about this, we have to ask the true question of why are you putting me through this, God? Why this is not the life that I planned for myself. I thought it was supposed to be all roses. I asked you into my heart. I turned it. You getting all excited, and you ask the question, God, where are you? Where are you? And to find the answer to this question, you can turn with me to James 1. And James 1, it says this: count it all joy, my brother, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. Nobody said amen when I first read that. We say it, but we don't say it when we're experiencing it. Count it all joy, brethren, when you hit trials of various kinds. The word trials can actually be switched in for different testings. Count it all joy when you're dealing with a season in your life where you're being tested. Knowing that it produces in you, what does it say? Steadfastness. It says that you may be perfect and complete. Did you notice why it didn't say perfect and complete as in like one word? It didn't say perfect or it didn't say complete. It says perfect and complete. Which means I got to ask the question, what does it mean to be perfect? And what does complete mean to God? And so if I'm going to ask the question of what it means to be perfect, that word perfect doesn't deal with perfection. It doesn't say that you're going to get through this perfectly fine. The word perfection there means spiritual maturity. Count it all joy when you go through trials, because when you get done with it, you will have a level of maturity in your spirit and your faith that you did not have before. Count it all joy that you may be perfect, mature in your faith, and complete. That word complete, it means a whole portion. So he says, count it all joy when you go through different testings, because in these testings, your spiritual man and your spiritual woman will grow. And so when you get done with this, that you will be complete. That means whole and lacking in nothing. The question I must ask myself is, if this is what is produced when I go through trials, then why am I not excited about it? If me going through some pain determines whether or not I'm complete and mature and lacking in some things. Lacking in a little bit. You're going to miss a little bit of it. No, it says complete and lacking in nothing. Then why would I not be excited when I'm dealing with testings? Could it possibly be that maybe my perspective of suffering is off? Could it be That the way that I'm looking at suffering is completely different. Could it possibly be that my perspectives of how I'm looking at suffering is through the eyes of this world? It's through the eyes of bitter and hurtful people. It's through the eyes of scarred people. Could it possibly be that the way I'm looking at suffering is from the wrong angle? So then I had to ask myself this question. I said, self, and myself said, what? I asked this question. I said, so then how do I understand what I will be complete in? What will allow me to be complete? What is this that I'm going to gain from the midst of me going through it? And through this, I came up with something that Holy Spirit gave me called the ABCs of suffering. And when we understand this idea of the ABCs of suffering, you know how they have the 5 levels of grief? And the 5 levels of grief, when you go through them, they allow you to know where you are at what time. I don't know, they got depression, denial, they got sadness, and all these different things that they have. But as you begin to look at them, they are a reference point of what you're going through. And so when I'm going with suffering and I'm going through suffering, how many of y'all say, God, look, I would be okay if you just let me know where I'm at. There's nothing worse than going through a workout when you're with a trainer or somebody and they don't tell you when it's about to end. I love how Pastor Obed began to speak about on Sunday. He began to speak about why do bad things happen to good people. I'm so glad that you got that topic. But when in the midst of that, he asked the question of why. Why do all these things go? What's going on? God, if you would have told me what I would have gone through before I went through it, there's no way I would have signed up for it. There's no way. I got to leave my family. Okay, God, you told me that I got to leave the comforts of LA, move over here to Haiti. I move out here to Palm Springs, and I got to deal with all of this heat. I got to deal with everything that's going on. God, if you're telling me I got to leave my comfort zone, go through the pain and go through the hurt of everything, God, choose me, I'll go, God. And you ain't saying none of that. But yet you're in this place where God is just telling you to do. So what is my markers? How do I know where I'm at in the level of suffering? Can I tell you that none of these are exclusive or in any order? These are just some markers that you can go with. But I want to give you the ABCs of suffering. When we understand suffering and what we go through, the first thing that we must understand is the A, is that suffering will alert you to self-aggravated assault. Self-aggravated assault. What happens is when I'm suffering or I'm going through something in my life, that suffering will alert me to areas in my life that I'm missing the mark. It will alert me to areas in my life that I'm making wrong decisions. It'll alert me to areas in my life that I've switched it and I've changed my mentality. And I brought up 2 Samuel because David's at this place where he's gotten into the kingdom and everything is gravy. He's in this promised land. He's walking and everything is okay. And what we find is that he ends up taking Bathsheba. And he takes Bathsheba and he ends up bearing a son, and then he commits murder and sets up his boy. That plot is worse than Scandal. Like, it's real deal. And here's what he says. Nathan comes to him and says, hey, what would you do? And he lays this story out, and it says David's anger burned inside him. He said, that man should be killed, and everything that he has, his family should be sold into slavery. And then Nathan turns and said, that man was you. And then all of a sudden, watch this. In verse 12, 13, it says, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord is with you. Don't worry about it. He's forgiven your sin. See, the suffering that he experienced at that moment alerted him of self-aggravated assault, something that he was doing to himself that was robbing him of the position and the place of where God had for him. A, it will alert you to self-aggravated assault. B, is that suffering will bring you to your true self. It will bring you to your true self. And look, let's be real. There are some troubles that we've been through that you would not have known how strong you were had you gone through it. There were certain attributes that were inside of you that came out of you that you did not know that came out of you. A certain level of resourcefulness that came out of you when your son comes to you and says, I'm hungry, but you have no money. You became Chef Emerald and you whooped something up real quick. And that resourcefulness would not have come out of you unless you'd done it. If you got beat and abused in your marriage and abused in your relationship, something will come out of you in the midst of that suffering that allows you to know I'm stronger. I've got more worth. I've got more self-esteem. You're not going to hit me another day of my life. I am greater than what I'm going through. It will bring you to yourself. In Joseph's case, in Genesis 39:4, he's in this place where he's gotten sold into slavery. His brothers threw him in the pit. He got sold into slavery. And now he's at this place where he's now in Potiphar's house. Watch this. In Genesis 39:4, it says this, so Joseph found favor in the sight and attended him, which is Potiphar. And Potiphar made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Can I tell you something? Sometimes you won't understand how strategic and how much of a manager you are until you get to a place of chaos and that you can't take it anymore. Joseph did not know that within him was somebody who could manage chaos and manage that, because the environment that he was in at that current moment treated him as a little baby boy. It babied the gift that was inside of him. So God says, I have to cause some suffering to come out of you so that you can be mature and not lacking and be complete in the areas that I have for you. Are you guys following me on this one? And so he's at this place that it brought him to his true self. So the question is in the midst of your suffering, are you asking the question, why me, or is it bringing you to your true self? The C is that when you're going through suffering, it will allow you to consider the sufficiency of God. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, Peter's dealing with some pain. Paul's dealing with some pain. He says, I got this thorn in my side. I got these messengers of Satan that are sent to buffet me. They're over there bugging me, and I can't get rid of this. God, why won't you move this suffering out of my life? And the answer that God gives them, he says, because my grace is sufficient. It's made perfect in your weakness. My grace is sufficient. The problem with a lot of us when we go into suffering is we don't consider the sufficiency of God. We don't understand that his power is greater than what I'm going through. I don't understand that, God, you are my sufficiency. You are the one who enables me to get through what I'm going through. I've relied on this person. I've relied on that person. I've relied on this relationship. I've relied on this job. But God says, no, my grace is sufficient. And my power is made perfect in your weakness or your suffering. And then we go to the D. And when you understand how God brings you into this next place, it will draw you closer to God so that you can discover his power. In the midst of my suffering, me going through what I'm going through, the D in the suffering will draw me to a place where I say, God, you are all I have. God, you are all I need. It will draw you to the place of God. I remember when I was struggling and I was in prison and I was trying to figure out, God, why aren't you letting me free? God, why am I going through this? He said this. He says, son, I would rather you go through hell every day of your life and call on me than for me to give you what you want and you never speak to me. See, in the midst of my suffering, it brought me to a place where I said, God, all I need is you. God, how do I understand this word? So I was in my cell and I was in solitary confinement and I had a crack of light and I slammed my face against that cell just so I can get a crack of light to read one word at a time in my Bible, because something inside of me said, God, you're all I need. And it was in the midst of my suffering that I began to discover the power of God. See, how can you understand if God is strong if you never have a weak moment? How can you understand if he's not Jehovah Jireh, your provider, if you've never been in need? How can you know that he's Jehovah Nissi, he's your shield, he's Jehovah Rapha, he's your healer? How do you know that if you've never been open and naked? How do you know that if you've never been sick? It will draw you to his power because you've been through suffering. A, B, C, D, E. when you suffer, the suffering becomes your exit strategy. The suffering becomes your exit strategy. What are you talking about, Pastor Jeff? You don't even know what you're talking about right now. Oftentimes, God gives us a promise. And when God gives us the promise, He never shows us the process. But what I have is a promise. And if I have a promise and I keep my eyes on the promise, the process is irrelevant. But if my perspective is wrong and I look at suffering as the end place, I'll never look at my promise. Catch this. The problem with us and why we cry when we deal with suffering is because we think that the pain I'm going in right now is the end of the book. When I'm suffering, I think that right now is all that there is, and God, you can't have anything great for me outside of my suffering right now at where I'm at. So I think that my suffering is my end result, that God, nothing good can come out of this place. I'm in a place called Nazareth. What good can come out of Nazareth? But they didn't know that there was an end of the story. They didn't know that there was a promise. So here's the catch. Joseph was given a promise. Now, can I tell you the problem with what he did? Oftentimes in life, we get more focused on the position rather than the mission of what God has for us. And so what happens is when I begin to suffer, I'm focusing on my position and not focusing on the mission that God has. And so when I'm focusing on my position and I'm not focusing on the mission, what happens is I tell people the dream and the position that God's going to give me, but I never share with them the mission behind the position. Let me break this down for you so I'll make it real clear. He told his brothers, you're going to bow down to me. I'm going to be elevated to a place of higher up. I'm going to be in a place where I'm going to be in a place of authority. And he was the least. And his brothers looked at him and said, what are you talking about? Why are you sharing with me your position? Why are you telling me about the position of where you are? The problem is that Joseph gave them the position without telling them the mission behind it. So the brothers got jealous because they didn't understand the mission. See, if the brothers understood that him getting elevated would save their lives one day, I don't think they would have thrown him in the pit. And if we're dealing with suffering, and I'm focusing on my position of where I'm at, and this goes for ministry. Everybody's so caught up in positions in ministry. Who's calling me this, and what name tag do I have? And I'm an elder bishop so-and-so. You're so focused on the position of where you're at that you forgot about the mission of why God called you to your workplace, why He called you to your job, why He called you to the ministry in the first place. So in the midst of my suffering, my prayer is God, I understand that my position is absolutely terrible right now, but if I look at the mission as a whole, allow me to accomplish your mission. Because here's what you understand. When you accomplish the mission, God will give you the position. And when you're in the position, God will give you the provision, to push the mission back forward again. Did you catch that? When you're focused on the mission, God will place you in the position and then give you the provision so that you can push the mission all over again. But the E became an exit strategy. Well, what are you talking about? Watch this. In Genesis 5:20, and this is what I really want to get to you guys because this was something that I could not understand. And Genesis 50, verse 20. Watch this. It blew me away. In verse 19, watch what happened. Starting in verse 18, it says, then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. Watch verse 19. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? Did y'all catch that? He said, don't be afraid. Am I not in God's place? Am I not in the place that God had already told me I was going to be before I've been through the pain that I went through? What are you tripping for? Am I not here? And oftentimes we focus so much on how we get there that we can't even celebrate when God takes us there. And so what happens is he says, why are you worried? Am I not in the place that God told me I was supposed to be? See, the issue with suffering and the issue with when God puts a calling and a destiny on your life is that oftentimes you going closer to your destiny looks like you're going backwards. God gave Joseph a vision that he would be in a place of authority. But the challenge is that Joseph ended up in a pit. Does that seem like it's closer to a place of authority? Absolutely not. So then Joseph goes from the pit, and then he's sold into slavery in Potiphar's house. Does that look like he's going backwards or forwards? It looks like his suffering is getting worse. And then he goes from Potiphar's house, getting lied upon, and then all of a sudden he ends up in prison. Does it look like he's getting closer to where he's supposed to be? Then he goes to prison and he interprets somebody's dream, and then he gets forgotten about. But here's the catch. What he didn't know was that each step that he thought was backward in the midst of his suffering was bringing him one step closer to being in the place where he's supposed to be. Now watch this. Wait. Before you start clapping. What was the difference? It was how he looked at the position of suffering. Because he understood this. He says, wait. My God is a God that says if he does it and he says it, he's got to complete it. So I don't care what I go through. If I change the way that I'm looking at my suffering and I'm able to count it all joy, I know that each suffering, each moment is taking me closer and closer and closer to where God wants me to be. But watch this. What he didn't understand was that his suffering was actually positioning. Oh my God, catch this. His suffering was actually positioning. Because what looked like a setback was a setup to get him to the place of the promise. Because when he thought he was further away from his destiny than ever before, he didn't know that he was right under the position. See, because the prison was underneath the palace. And some of you right now are in the season of your life where God is trying to figure out, will you change your perspective on how you're looking at your suffering and see that this is your exit strategy? But if you're crying so much and if you're so upset that you'll miss that the position is right underneath the palace. Go ahead, y'all sit down. I'm supposed to teach today. I ain't preaching. Listen this. What would have happened if when Joseph got to the place where he got thrown in the pit, he gave up hope? What would happen if he got to the place of Potiphar's house and decided to have a bad attitude? I'm nowhere where I'm supposed to be anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and kick these cows and feed these cows, and I'm not going to take care of anything, because I had a dream, and I had a purpose, and God, you're taking me through all of this right now, and where are you, God? No. What would have happened if Joseph was so bitter because of the suffering that he thought he was facing that he didn't even open up his heart and his mind to use the gifting that got him out of the prison? Could it be possible that some of us are so bitter at my position that you're not even using your gifting to get you into the palace? See, we're looking at this idea of suffering, and we must have the proper perspective. Because if I don't have the proper perspective, I'll miss out on the palace. What perspective do you have? Because had you not gone through all of these things, you wouldn't have known how strong you were. Some of y'all wouldn't have known who Jesus was. Your marriage never would have been saved. See, if you don't know you're broken, how can God fix you? And so the moment was an exit strategy. What are you talking about, Pastor Jeff? Watch this. We all go looped back to verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Watch this. In order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. In these last 2 minutes, can I get real with you guys, like real? Can I tell you that when we ask the question, God, why do you allow suffering? That's not the question we're asking. We ask the question, God, if I'm going through pain, why are you not relieving me of this pain? But what if I told you that you're not even asking the right question? The real question that we should be asking is, Jesus, why did you suffer?